Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Magic the Gathering unofficial audiobooks podcast. My name is Phil Dawson, and we have made it, folks. I thought we had more time on this one, but I didn't look very far ahead, and here we are at the finale. I have a whole bunch of thank yous to all of the listeners out there. Thank you so much, especially my patrons, right? Including our longest subscribed patrons. We launched the Loyalty Rewards Club and started sending out merch, and very excited to get some of the feedback from that. I actually got some samples, and the stuff is, it's cool. It's cool to have. And also, we have to decide where we're going next. So head to the Discord. We need to discuss this. Our sponsors, we had our first sponsor for this book, Wongway Woods, the disc golf course in Butte, Texas. Thank you so much. They were our first sponsor, and our partnership with the customizable Shadowbox cubes, etsy.com/shop/apes and capes. We've had quite a run up to this point, so please enjoy. Don't forget to stick around for the epilogue at the end of this episode, and then we'll be back with our next book. So thank you so much, everyone. Again, if you like what you hear, if you want to help support to keep this thing going, just check out the Patreon. We're there for you. Just search my name, Phil Dawson. Peace, everyone. We'll see you soon. Chapter 26. Krogh had waited for this day. Tremor rumbled through the floors of the stronghold, and in places metal bracing squealed under new stress. Such quakes were commonplace these last several years, a result of running the machinery so hard for so long. With each day, the purpose of Wrath came so much closer to being fulfilled. Then only the task of the Dark Lord would remain. Dominaria would belong to the Ineffable. Pushing for that day, Devol had decided on another inspection. He'd try to find a way to silence the tremors, but at the same time, he pushed the Vec and the machinery all the harder. Guards in tow, he started his routine, left his negator behind. For better than 2 centuries now, Krogh had worked to heal himself, a slow and even painful process, though at times the pain had been rather exquisite to feel. The culture and growth of new meat, the slow infusing with artifice, mixing his blood with fresh, glistening oil. His strength had taken decades to rebuild, bringing back his powers even as he learned to alter and improve on his old design. Now came the time of testing himself, of reversing the shift in Wrath's power that occurred the day he'd been struck down by the Witch King Craig. Today, he would destroy the first of Devol's supports. The Negator waited in its alcove near the throne, sawtooth shield in one hand and its other, tipped in both claws and corrosive fluid plungers. It shifted when the Inner Circle member entered the room, setting itself into a state of preparedness. Krogh would not allow it to turn more on guard. The Phyrexian's eyes blazed a hard red. Searing beams of energy lashed out to split the hardened, wrinkled flesh that covered the Negator's face. This would be Krogh's second battle for Wrath's throne room. He had every intention of victory. The Negator's movement was a dark blur, springing from its resting place, shield blocking Krogh's attack as it swept in with its claws. Krogh could never be so fast, though he came close. The Phyrexian master relied on his armored bands to make up the difference, the metal strips fully repaired as well and equal to the task. They turned the claws to the beast, though few were spattered by the corrosive sludge. Krogh struck back, but already the Negator was past and pulling up short on the other side of the room. It stalked back carefully, watching for its opening. Sampling the corrosive material the Negator had used been part of Krogh's plan. Knowing his body capable of withstanding any of the older chemical attacks, he had doubted Devol's latest was too different. Radical leaps were not part of the Coruscant's way, preferred slow, methodical improvement. Such was the case here. The sludge burned into Krogh's bands, but failed to cause much more than a mild distraction. A rasping slide of metal and a new coat of glistening oil, and the annoyance was gone. Now, it was Krogh's turn. He leapt for the Negator, offering it a deadly embrace. The saw-blade shield slammed into his side, cutting past several metal bands and damaging the completed flesh beneath. More of the claws scored deep wounds, but now Krogh had the measure of the corrosive, and his body was already working to negate its effect. One of the Inner Circle members' skeletal hands shot out to dig razored fingers into the negator's chest. They cut deeply, then began to vibrate with a new life. Where Krog's artifice-blended flesh pierced the negator, a new process began. The negator's flesh reacted with Krog's merging. The Phyrexian Master's entire hand slid into the negator, then his arm up to elbow. The negator began to twist violently now, feeling the invasion but unable to react as its own flesh and artifice turned against it. Krog reveled in his triumph, knowing instantly that he could consume the negator's entire being in this way. Such an expenditure of power for so simple a creature was not necessary. The negator was fast, deadly in its own right, but could never stand against a fully operational member of the Inner Circle. It would add so little to him, Krog would wait for a better opportunity. With a wrenching pull, Krog ripped his arm free, and so brought with it the negator's flesh and machinery already consumed. He left behind a hole that bled oil, thick black blood. The negator was well built, keeping to its feet, though all the fight had gone out of it. Krog lashed out with both taloned hands, raking off large swathes of flesh and gouging into bone and metal support. The shield came up. Krog ripped it from the other's grasp, hurling it with all the Phyrexian's force so that it actually struck into the armored walls of the throne room. The clawed hand rose sluggishly, and the member of the Inner Circle caught it and used searing whips of energy from his eyes to sever it at the wrist. Still, the negator remained standing. Just how long could it stand up under such damage, Krog wondered. With something very much akin to physical pleasure, the Phyrexian set to work. A violent quake shook the stronghold as if the plane's flowstone foundation had shifted under the weight of the towering fortress and its processing equipment. Devol slowly paced the short aisle that ran between both lines of negators. For the Phyrexians to his side, each was a deadly instrument. They were the result of his centuries of effort, tailoring the best of the negator abilities into ever more efficient creations. If not for the unknown strengths of planeswalkers, Devol might have thought any one perfectly suited for the task of killing Urza. As is, they were his best and last gamble. A particularly sobering thought. Devol was now forced to gamble his hard-won power in this bid against the Walker's life. Still fresh in his perfect memory was the day of several months prior when he came into the Stronghold's throne room. The oil mixed with blood was pooled in the middle of the room and splattered in streaks and splotches against the walls. He remembered the scent of flesh, meat spoiling in the fortress's warmth. He found his own guardian negator shredded, fouling the throne room. It was not defeated, not dead, but shredded, rent down into pieces so small that it could only be done with a deliberate and determined effort. It could only be credited to Krog. It was a message, not subtly at all, that Devol's immunity from the Phyrexian Inner Circle member had expired. For the first time in many centuries, Devol remembered a trace of fear he had once felt for the Phyrexian, the cold touch along his back and the metallic taste of a mouth suddenly dry in nervousness. Fear, as would forever be the case, was a wonderful motivator. Devol brought the production of Flowstone up yet again, pushing his workers and the machinery well past their limits. The secondary attractors shook with constant tremors, at times twisting against the stronghold itself, but the counterbalancing torque built into their design allowed for such abuse. Today's earlier visit, in fact, set a new threshold for the equipment. He also stepped up other projects, readying a private army capable of killing the land of Yawgmoth once and for all. Of course, he bent himself strongly to the task of killing Urza. Destroying the Walker was the one act Devol knew could assure his continued position as Evencar on Vrath. It could bring him closer to the completion he desired. His body was already strengthened to the point where aging and routine damage could not hurt him, yet Devol still knew many of his physical limitations of flesh: heat and cold, pain and discomfort. The Evencar looked only towards protecting his mind, allowing it an immortal existence free of such encumbrances. For now, however, he could only imagine the benefits of such a form while the threat of Krog hung over his pre-sent life. That threat colored everything darker in an already black land. It interfered with Devol's ability to think straight, to plan. One final nod completed the inspection. Nothing seemed amiss, and the Evencar could think of no other refinements that might make the difference. None he had time for at any rate. "Find her as a planeswalker," he ordered. The floor shook again, causing him to stumble to a wall rather than be cast to the ground. Cracks showed in one flowstone wall, then reformed to a smooth surface under his mental direction. "Find and kill him. Go! Each negator turned away, stepping for their own portals, which already stood open at the back wall. Then they were gone, tracking. Deval stood alone in the throne room, trying to sort through so many mental notes and decide on his next action. Another quake worked its way up through the floor and along the walls, a grinding tremor that seeped up past the armored soles of his boots to churn inside his stomach. This time it did not fade immediately, setting off a sympathetic shaking that reflected back from the other directions. Something was wrong. Deval sensed it. The stronghold was by no means a sentient entity, but he had known it for so long that he sometimes felt a connection to it that had nothing to do with the flowstone properties or the great machinery at his command. That connection spoke of danger. Now the walls shook, but not the floor, decidedly unsettling. Deval called for guards, led them toward one of the bridges he had ordered built in the 1st century as steward, a construction which held one of the secondary attractors. Even through half a kilometer of flowstone and metal, Deval felt the grinding of metal tearing into metal, of gears stripped or screeching as the joints threatened to bind. Before he had crossed the bridge's expanse, Deval was running. Why this day of all others, he wondered briefly, allowing his emotions to color his thoughts. Why not tomorrow or the following year? More precise logic returned. Why not last week or the last decade? Whatever the problem, it happened now. To solve the problem was paramount, not to make matters the more difficult by dwelling on his own frustrations. The upper chambers were frantic with workers running about trying to bring machinery back under control. The sealed shaft that housed the large driving screws twisted against its mountings. Machinery rattled and a pipe ruptured to pour cold lake water over the floor. The water flashed to steam where it was washed up against hot steel, raising an instant steam bath. Deval ordered the local supervisors, captured by his guards, stopping them to put questions forward. Frantic work degraded into chaos, with the workers suddenly bereft of leadership. Deval grabbed one by the shoulders, lifting it off the floor and shaking it like he might a rag doll. "What is happening?" he yelled at it, not thinking to place the touch upon its mind. In this hectic environment, he likely would have failed regardless. The entire bridge shook, throwing half the workers and even a few Phyrexians to the ground. "What is it?" One worker leapt for Deval's face, gaze wild and panicked, swinging a sharply tapered tool. Phyrexian soldier skewered him on its sword, held the Vec dangling in the air while blood seeped out from around the edges of the blade, and cast it down to the floor. The Vec supervisor waved down other workers who looked about to snap under the stress and sudden violence. The supervisor then pointed down, jabbering at Deval in its own speech. Whatever the problem, it came from below, the complex mechanisms of the bladed dials that pulled lava up from the furnaces far underground. Deval wasted no time with more questions. He kicked at the lifeless worker, venting rage and frustration. "Kill them," he ordered 2 guards. "All but that one." As per his standing orders, the supervisors were punished in watching their people die. Then he was running again, his steam-sodden cloak trailing behind him and his armored boots ringing against steel decking. The bulk of his Phyrexian escort followed. They found stairs and spiraled down to the depths of the machinery into the main gears room. The room curved about the central shaft, immense in the open space contained within, the walls but made confining by an array of steam pipes, clockwork gears, and various machinery. A hideous screeching filled the space. Machinery worked too hard, tearing itself apart under the stresses applied. The room was out of a nightmare, awash in an orange glow, the light cast through the large portals in the shaft's shielding by lava as it spilled upward, driven by the spinning blades. Yellow steam spilled from cracked valves and warped piping. The scent of sulfur was heavy in the room's jungle dampness. Dozens, possibly scores, of Vec leapt from overhead concealment or from under deck plates suddenly loose and sliding over hiding holes built into the flooring. They'd been driven to the limits of their endurance, and now, with the stronghold apparently collapsing about them, it had all they had left in him to do. They struck out at their tormentor. As other doors opened to admit more into the large theater filled with steam pipes and an incredible array of clockwork gears, they numbered better than 100. Against a dozen Phyrexian troops, such ill-trained warriors were at a disadvantage. The black-armored soldiers hewed their way through the wave of bodies. Blood splattered the floor and machinery, drying quickly into rust-like streaks against the dark metal. The floor trembled and continued to shake longer than it had previously with the earlier tremors. Machinery tore loose of mountings, tumbling about the floor and indiscriminately crushing Vec and Phyrexian alike. A gear arm shattered and came crashing down in a ringing clatter. The screeching wail grew louder and louder until it seemed tangible, which was likely the cause of the violent vibrations. The great complex machinery, Deval's design, was tearing itself apart under high speeds and stresses. The Evencar screamed his frustration, attempting to find some way to bring it back under his control. He didn't know the machinery like the Vec had relied on them to maintain it, and this group was beyond even acknowledging his demands. It would need dispatching and new workers brought in to shut down the system, except there was no time for such a change of personnel. He spared one thought for the workers in chambers above before remembering he had ordered them slain. Events had conspired against him in a way even Crow could not have. Duvall made up his mind then to flee, able to recoup his losses for another day. Barely was the decision reached, however, when the floor suddenly pitched up sharply as if struck from below with a mountainous fist. Walls bowed and crumpled, and the ceiling caved downward, raining shafts and toothy gear wheels. While still airborne, Duvall felt a metal pinion impale him. It came down hard, spitting blood from between his thin, pale lips. And the gear fell across the back of his legs, crushing them and pinning him into place. Pain flared in his mind, cloaking any thoughts of saving himself with a panicked desperation. A hideous rumble of stressed and avalanching metal overrode the noise of the overhead gears, still spinning wildly and trying to complete their function. The floor dropped out from beneath them all, and the entire bridge and shaft collapsed down into the lower caldera. Duvall, Avatar of Wrath, fell with it. Scorched metal and molten rock, the sense of hell. Duvall knew only those scents and pain. Never-ending pain as the mountain of collapsed metal struts and supports, machinery and gearwork continued to shift and grind. The molten glow of the lava had faded some time before, could not say when. He didn't think it had touched him, the scent of charred flesh being that of others and long since cleared from the scalding air. Now darkness reigned, broken only by the occasional spark as metal shifted and struck against metal and flowstone. It was light enough to show him that his head and one arm remained free in a small space. The rest of him had been caught under an avalanche of gearwork, toothy wheels, pinions, and shafts. He faded into and out of consciousness, praying for rescue or death, either one after so long. This was the curse of near completion. His body was simply unable to die, keeping his mind alive but not strong enough to allow him to free himself. With no voice for calling out, his restricted air intake was not enough for speech. It was barely enough to feed his brain, and perhaps not even that. The veil clouding his thoughts threatened a slow, torturous death of his mind. The only thing Duvall had never possessed of true value. So he fought, trying to stay alive. He focused on the brimstone sense of his prison and the sound of grinding metal as the avalanche continued a slow fall toward entropy. He listened to the drip of water pinging against steel plates and the rasping whisper of steel bands rubbing together. Krog. Twin sparks of flame hovering in the black. Artificial night. Flared up to offer dim light to see by. Duvall noticed the dark doorway of an open portal behind the Phyrexian. There were no Vec laborers, no guards, just Krog, making his way carefully to Duvall's position. No humping walk or raspy breath. The nightmare had been reborn. Duvall remembered the way in which Krog had dismantled the negator set to protect the steward. The Phyrexian could likely free Duvall from this misfortune. Duvall would do anything for release. He'd been able to speak, he would have promised whatever was asked of him, would have pledged the rest of his life to Krog's service. Except the rest of his life was exactly what Krog intended to take. Extending one clawed hand, Krog set a single finger against Duvall's black armored skull cap, right where the circular depression would be. The Avatar knew with a sudden wave of fear. He felt the sharp stab of fresh pain as Krog physically dug into his mind and began to drain the steward's memories, sifting knowledge from experience and taking both for himself. The Phyrexian was heedless of the damage this procedure caused, never planning to release Duvall and always having planned to drain the other in this way. Duvall felt his mind slipping away, leaving only the knowledge that he remained trapped, alone, and in pain. He had been given a long existence of suffering, robbed of the one thing he had ever treasured. Krog was gone, having taken what he had come for, finished with Duvall, once and for all. Krog paced the small plateau, feeling with every step how the surface might bend and reshape itself to his will. His will, but bent by the skill of Duvall. Never before had the Phyrexian drained so much from a single subject. Several lifetimes' worth of experience and accumulated knowledge were all now at Krog's disposal. The ability of Flowstone, the evolution of negators, the trials Duvall had fought in Yawgmoth, and the hatred, undeniable and uncompromising for Krog. Everything was there, including how Duvall had planned to dispose of the Phyrexian, and when Krog circumvented those plans by destroying the negator, how Duvall would have used the death of Urza Planeswalker to elevate his position in the Dark God's gaze. Urza Planeswalker had found Wrath. There was no denying the evidence. The ruined shell of a negator lay upon the flowstone. Tortured metal and some desiccated and petrified flesh was all that remained. Crow could see the creature fighting Urza and then escaping back to Wrath, leading the walker right back to Phyrexia's most secret plan. Why not? Devola never thought to instruct them against such a feat. Urza had tracked the negator back, finished it off, and then escaped with the knowledge of Wrath's existence. Urza would have recognized the nature of this plane and its ultimate purpose at once. It was the staging ground for the coming invasion. The Planeswalker would sense it, and in the voices of the Vec or one of the other races brought across, he could find confirmation if necessary. There were no doubts. In the back of his mind, where Krogh had stored the mental essence of the Vol, the Phyrexian heard the Evankar's dark laugh. Could Urza Planeswalker be killed? The Vol had thought so, but Krogh no longer felt sure. Perhaps only the Dark One would be able to destroy the Walker, but no doubts remained now that Krogh would have to try. He'd have to do it himself personally, and that required drawing the Planeswalker into the open, a feat not accomplished in the assaults on Keld or in any fighting since, but Benalia. That seemed so much more likely. Benalia or Yavimaya. Either should do. Both of those would have to be dealt with before Krogh could ever face the Dark Lord again, even in his dreams. The Negators and troops would be called into battle, and a preliminary strike to herald the coming invasion. The Planeswalker would show, and he would fight. Krogh would be ready to meet him, to kill him. He would do the job himself rather than continue to trust failing subordinates. He would test his own mettle, and metal, as he had once already, proving that he remained Krogh, favored of the ineffable, of the inner circle of Phyrexia. Epilogue. The Heir. Baron watched as the last student filed from the slow time end of the time lock. He'd be carting out records and other files today, cleaning out the last of his personal effects on the morrow. The final evacuation of the buildings might take weeks, cataloging every scrap of paper, but nothing would be lost in this move. Eventually the buildings would be torn down for their raw materials, even the paving stones would be pried out of the ground and the fresh soil possibly excavated for a healthy landfill. The necessity of such scavenging only underscored his resolve that Tolaria had been left unmanaged for too long. The Master Mage paused at the time lock entrance for one last look about his home, at the slow time envelope that had been his world for so long. It was just another lie or a half-truth, once believed for the sake of convenience, but no more. Dominaria was his home, his world, and he would not remain isolated in his self-inflicted exile any longer. Recent events had finally driven through the need for his return, the need for Tolaria's return. The misted slow time waters were damp on his skin as he passed into the first chamber, the fog seemingly alive in the blue glow of mage-lit stones. It swirled about him, reminding him of monumental events in his life, and Baron's mind formed patterns out of the chaos. He could see, constructed of tiny beads of water, the fortress compound of the First Academy, torn apart by magical upheavals brought on by their temporal experiments. The same catastrophe that had shattered Tolaria's temporal fabric and created the pockets of slow and fast time. There, in the corner formed out of the mist, was the new Tolaria, the ship that had hosted the Academy in those years following the destruction of the first school, and crashed through the waves until making landfall once again on the island shores. Above his head, near the ceiling in a swirling spire of fog, was the rise of the Second Academy and the Mist Wraiths, which were of course the Phyrexians come to tear down all they had built. One larger swirl of misted waters sparkled against a mage stone, the Weatherlight, smashing through the rest just as it had helped carry the day on Sarah's realm. Yes, he remembered those years well enough, the dark and the light of them. The breeze of his passage shredded the mist image. He remembered back on times and events that stood out visibly in his memory. He recalled the early days, acting at times as surrogate father along with Urza and Gatha in creation of the Metathran Warriors simulacra, even as he started his own family and locked both he and Rain away behind temporal doors. Thought about the Bloodlines and their many incarnations, tearing at the unity of the Academy and then moving in force out into Dominaria. He saw Keld cast into ruins, its people only now recovering from their several centuries of Phyrexian testing. He felt for the Capuchin clan of Benalia, desperately wounded, along with a half-dozen other strong centers of the Bloodlines. And now, Karn was missing. Master Mage shook his head, so many lives disrupted. So far yet to go. A warm, tropical sun shook the chill from Baron's skin as he passed from the final chamber and back into real time. The deep blue sky might have been a reflection of the ocean waters, except for a few snowy clouds that drifted lazily overhead. He blinked against the bright day and took a deep draw of the salt tang ocean breeze. No more mistakes, he promised himself. Care for a stroll about the island? No mistaking that soft, beautiful voice. Though Baron still noted its hesitant approach, he turned to one of the stone benches that sat to either side of the time lock. Rain sat there, her silk robes gathered about her, each hand tucked into the opposing sleeve. Long, raven hair cascaded down over both shoulders, brown eyes studying him in a mixture of concern and hope. "Been waiting long?" he asked. "Not long," she admitted. "A few hours. I heard that you were closing down all the slow time offices and labs. I saw the students go in earlier and hoped that you might be coming out with them." She stood as graceful as ever, though she kept her arms crossed protectively in front of her. Baron nodded. "However long we have left," he said slowly, "I'd rather spend it on Tolaria. The real Tolaria." He paused at a loss of where Rain intended to take the conversation. "The Weatherlight has not left yet, has it?" "No, though Maltani and Rafellos hope to continue on their way soon. Do you want to talk with them? I already arranged for a group of scholars to interview them on what happened in Yavimaya." "I wouldn't mind speaking with Maltani. I also want to send the Weatherlight toward Argiv. I hope to arrange a new trade of scholars with the Argivian University. Might have knowledge of ways to repair some of the damage done to Tolaria. Might give us a chance," he said, the various meanings warming the mage. Rain smiled then, bright and wonderful. Her eyes gleamed with a hint of mischief. She took his hand in hers, guided it to the slight swell of her abdomen. "Give us all a chance, then. I'm pregnant." The revelation shook Baron to his core. A smile in answer to Rain's own spread across his face, a reflection of the warmth he felt inside. What better omen to begin the start of a new life? "Shall we head to the new offices, then?" Rain asked. "So much to get done." Baron shook his head, enjoying the brief spark of confusion that flashed on his wife's face. "I'll take you up on your first suggestion. Stroll about the island." No more mistakes, he had promised himself. No matter the demands placed on him, Baron could not allow himself to ignore the very reasons for which he fought. No one could. Not if they were to believe in a better life after the battle. The legacy in the air, if there ever will be one, and wait until tomorrow. Someone else would simply have to watch over Dominaria today. Jamura's mountain peaks were barely a smudge over the line of the horizon, promise of the distance still to be traveled. Behind Karn, the sun fell low over the Boda Sea, sunset crimson splashed against the heavens. A sailor's good omen, Karn had learned in taking ships across the Boda, but it reminded the golem of nothing more than the blood spilled behind him in Benalia. The lives lost in protecting Urza's plans were not lost for nothing. Karn made sure of that. A wind touched already with evening's chill raked the grass. The full glimmer moon rose low on the eastern horizon, promising some gray light by which to travel this night. One heavy step followed another, the same tireless pace that had carried the golem away from Dalat and finally out of Benalia. He had stopped at villages only when necessary, once to engage a silversmith for repairs to his body, 4 more times to complete at least part of his mission as tasked by Urza Planeswalker. In the water crossing, he kept to his cabin and away from prying eyes. He had been brought ashore by longboat, away from any port city, and as of necessity far from his final destination. Terry's face still haunted the golem, pale and drawn after the narrow battlefield victory that cost her brother and landed the responsibilities of Clan Capuchin upon her shoulders. Karn had not forgotten her, but again his conflicting loyalties called for compromise. Stay with her or follow Urza's orders. Life versus legacy. The Planeswalker still worried more for his collection of clockwork, sculpting, and magical devices than he ever would of those peoples whose lives he's touched. His only words to Karn after the death of the Phyrexian incursion in Benalia had been to direct a recovery of legacy items. "The legacy," he said to Karn. "Collect what you can and take it away from Benalia. You will find protection in Jamura. I will locate you there." He grimaced. "When I can." He had smiled with a grim sort of self-satisfaction and winked from existence, stepping in between worlds. Perhaps it was better that Urza kept his words so simple. Walker would never be convinced of anything other than his own genius, his own plans for the future of Dominaria. Life versus legacy. For Karn, the choice came easily. Terry Capuchin would remain in his memory for as long as Karn could keep her there. Karn might not even remember this day when the invasion came, if the full invasion ever came, but he would live the next 2 decades at least secure in the knowledge that the Capuchin heroes lived on through at least one child. One more life that might someday make a difference. Carry the legacy from Benalia, Urza had charged him. Protect it until found again by the Planeswalker. Karn did carry several artifact pieces of the legacy, and in his arms, swathed in new, thick blankets, he carried another part of the legacy. What might well be the last surviving Capuchin hero, the infant, Gerard, Terry's orphaned grandson, and her final request of Karn that the silver golem take him somewhere safe. Urza Planeswalker focused on his human components as his special path to an end product rather than for their own special talents and abilities, living among them, caring for them as children, and often befriending them as adults. The golem instead recognized in each the spirit that defied Phyrexia and promised any form of salvation. Urza had been wrong in that. Perhaps they would not wield the legacy in its final form and discover how to defeat Phyrexia once and for all time, but one of them survived. How many more might be critical to the future? This was a simple truth which Karn, in his limited memory, had recognized, where Urza Planeswalker, in his millennia of experience, had not. Every one of them, bloodline subject or not, was a separate hope for Dominaria, could make a final difference that might stand between life and loss. This one Karn would keep safe, so that in his own life, Gerard Capuchin might hope to make a difference, the mark of a true hero.